Hi, everybody. Hopefully you're all there. Yes, I can see you coming through on my little counter. So I'm Steve Smedley, QT Associate, and welcome to the first of our autumn webinars that aim to pick up on the white paper, but also extremely topical themes. So in this case, we're talking about compliance with the rent standard, which has caught a lot of people out, a lot of providers out over the last 2 to 3 years, including downgrades. So I'd also like to welcome Angela Lomax from DTP. Give them a wave, Angela. There she is. So she's going to demystify the rent regulations and associated regulation. She's also going to tell you a bit about what you need to know about your rents to be assured of compliance, and where some of the pitfalls are that's led a number of providers to come croppers on it. But before I hand over to Angela, just the tedious housekeeping stuff. This webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. If you've got a tech issue during the session, use the chat function at the bottom of your toolbar to contact James. James, give him a wave. James is going to sort out all of your technical needs associated with this and not the other IT problems you might have. Angela will take questions at logical pauses in her presentation. So please be armed with your questions. To put a question to Angela, use the Q&A tool, which is also along the toolbar on the bottom. I keep saying it's on the bottom. With some of you, depending on your type, the kind of software you've got, I think it might be, if you're looking at it on a Mac or something like that, it might be along the top. But use that Q&A function to post succinct and to the point questions that I can sift through and put to Angela as an active chair, if you like. So I'll be putting those questions to Angela verbally. For the avoidance of doubt, we are recording this, so it will be available for posterity for you to refer back to and for you to signpost to your colleagues that couldn't make it today. We'll also be putting up a copy of Angela's presentation. So that's me. Without further ado, over to you, Angela.
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Angela Lomax. I'm a director at DTP. We're a consultancy that works predominantly with housing providers of all different types and sizes on a whole range of different issues. I lead the governance and strategy practice, and for my sins, I now know a little bit more about rent than I've ever known in the past, purely because, as Steve said, it is a real topic of interest at the moment. I'm going to, I should say, the reason I say that is my background is housing management, and then after that, performance, and for my sins again, 3 years as a regulator. I don't think I've ever spent as much time thinking about rent as I have done over the past 2 to 3 years. So it probably gives you an indication of how important compliance with the rent standard has become. So I'm going to talk you through the approach to the regulations and the associated legislation, and I'll explain a little bit why there are clear distinctions around that, and what you need to know as officers in order to provide assurance and ensure that you're compliant. And if there are any board members on the webinar today, what you need to be looking for in terms of gaining that assurance that you're a compliant organisation. I am going to give you an early warning that some of this is quite technical and in some places quite complicated. There are layers of guidance, layers of regulation associated with rent. It's possibly one of the reasons why it has become a bit of a sticky issue within the sector. Hopefully I'm going to take you through this in a logical way. And I'm going to stop, as Steve says, from time to time to pick up any questions, and there'll be some time at the end as well to pick up any sort of general questions around it. When I say questions, I'm probably not going to be able to answer anything specific to do with your organisation, but certainly give you some oversight around what you need to be addressing within your rent policy and your way of working. So In relation to the legislation and regulations, of course, everything starts with the Regulator of Social Housing. I've already said it's technical, it's complex, but it is an absolute fundamental requirement of being a registered provider. And there are a number of reasons for that, which I'm going to take you through. But as Steve and I were just chatting, and it is absolutely fundamental to key decision making within the organisation about what you might do in terms of new business, what you might do in terms of change to address particular housing needs. It is quite important that you have clarity around what that means for you as an organisation. It's also been quite a lot of change over the recent years in relation to specific requirements or the way that the regulator has set out those requirements. And there are very specific and distinct standards for different forms of tenure, and also about what you can do if you move or change tenures. And that's quite an important thing to recognise, and often has caught providers out. There's also very specific terminology which we use. We're terrible, aren't we, in the housing sector around jargon, but in particular around rent. There are specific definitions for particular words that we use: affordable with a lowercase a, affordable with an uppercase a, which have very, very specific distinctions. The one thing that I would say is a big lesson, and one of the reasons that a number of registered providers have found themselves with some regulatory attention, is because of data quality and the data that they're providing within their statistical returns not matching perhaps what's set out in business plan returns, FFR returns, the two things, or there have been significant changes year on year to what your portfolio looks like in terms of tenure and rent. So these things, the whole thing about the regulator talking quite a lot at the moment around data quality and data assurance does link directly into the compliance with the rent standard as well. I think the one thing I would also say is, of course, stating the obvious really, that rental income is all about viability for an organisation. And again, just been talking with an organisation where their viability is compromised somewhat through the fact that they've realised that they have been incorrectly setting rents for many, many years. It's probably an extreme example, but you know, could have a significant impact on what you can do in relation to investment in your stock, investment in new stock, etc. going forward. The regulator is also under some pressure from the Treasury to ensure that rents are set appropriately, because of course they align quite directly with housing benefit and universal credit, and there is a need to control welfare spending, and rents is an obvious starting point to look at that. And just to add, if you did want to read something following this webinar, one of the things I would recommend, particularly if you can't sleep at night, is the addendum to the sector risk profile from March 2020, which talks specifically about rent. There's some clear lessons to be learned from the regulators' feedback in that sector risk profile. So just in relation to rent regulation overall, if we take as a starting point what you need to have in place as very basic level assurance within your organisation, it is about a series of different sort of checks and controls. And I'm probably going to read this slide from bottom up. At the very basic level, you need to have a rent policy in place. Lots of organisations do have rent policies, but it's usually kind of dusty document which sits in the drawer and hasn't been reviewed recently. It hasn't been updated very recently. Our advice is that your rent policy should be looked at on an annual basis, probably as part of your preparation for rent review. So sometime around this time of year, when you're starting to think about implementing the rent review for March of the following year. That rent policy needs to be accurate. And when I say that, it means it needs to refer to and cross-reference to the current legislation and the current regulatory guidance. And in particular, it should set out how your organisation applies the rent policy to different tenures. If you have exempt accommodation, which I'll talk about later, how that is, how the board is assured about that and how you review that. how you approach market rent review, whether you've got supported housing in place, whether you're going to use the flexibility that's allowed within the rent standard. All of these things I'm going to refer to shortly, but your policy needs to set those things out. As part of your controls and assurance process, you should have some kind of external audit, but a word of warning here. Your external audit should be against the rent standard and the legislation, not against your own policy. If your policy is incorrect, then what's the point in having an external audit of something that's incorrect? So your policy should be part of that external audit, as in, your auditors are looking at it to make sure it's appropriate. And from time to time, if you wanted to have a more robust external validation where you kind of work through some sample testing of your portfolio, that's another good idea. So the officer-led, staff-led certification around the relevant areas of regulation should then flow into the board's assurance of compliance. The board really shouldn't be shouldn't be having to scrutinise in detail those layers of compliance. But the board needs to have a strong assurance that you are a compliant organisation. In terms of regulation, I think there's it's really important, a sort of very, very basic starting point that I can't really explain how many times this is completely overlooked in terms of rent policy and rent compliance, is actually the Housing and Regeneration Act of 2008, which provides the definition of what social housing and what a registered provider actually is. And it's amazing how many registered providers have forgotten about this, particularly, long-standing traditional providers who were registered ages ago and haven't had to think about, the purpose and them as a registered entity for a very long time. But there is a very clear statement in section 69, which says that accommodation from a registered provider, which is social housing, must have rents which are below the market level. And it is amazing how many times this is missed. Now, of course, there are tenures which allow you to set rents at a certain percentage of the market level, which I'll come back to. There are also exemptions, but the starting point for any provider building, providing, acquiring any form of accommodation which it is seeking to let as a registered provider is that the baseline core rent must be below market rate. If you are then providing supported housing or exempt accommodation, you can layer on top of that the additional elements that you need in order to then comply with exemption criteria, which I'll come to in a moment. But it is amazing how many times this has been missed. And it is, if anybody has been keeping an eye on what's going on in terms of the lease-based housing sector, this is one of the key areas of non-compliance, that rents have been set with no regard to this particular requirement, which is a fundamental requirement of being a registered provider. And I'll just do a couple more slides before I stop for some questions. Just the linkage in terms of regulatory standards and regulatory compliance is within the RSH's governance and financial viability standard, and that requires you to adhere to all relevant law, which is why I'm going to talk about legislation as well as the rent standard, and that you must certify compliance with the standards. And of course, rent setting is part of that standard, but there's also the value for money standard, which has some requirements around ensuring that you are using your resources appropriately, and those resources are usually drawn from compliance with the rent standard. And I think the other part of it is around risk management and internal control. So rent compliance or the absence of assurance around rent compliance is clearly a risk, but controls around how you set your rents and how you review your rents is part of that that risk management framework. And finally, and I've realised that the departmental reference here has not been updated since the change, but the policy statement is still the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government Policy Statement Form 2019. That is the key document which sets out the government policy which is then reflected in the rent standard and the associated legislation. Told you there were layers, I told you it was complex, but the rent standard makes continuous reference, so the regulator's rent standard makes continuous reference to the policy statement, and the policy statement makes continuous reference to the legislation which sits behind it. Quite important. There are, again, one of the things that myself and my colleagues have been quite surprised about is how many people working in registered providers have never even looked at this policy statement. And yet the policy statement is probably the more detailed articulation of the rent standard. Before I get into some policy detail, I'm just going to stop and check whether there are any questions at this point.
Right, thanks for that, Angela. No questions at this point. What I will say is just remind, oh, hang on, we've just got one come in. Yes, just for everybody's benefit, in case you missed it, guys, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of the toolbar to post your questions to Angela. So yes, we've got Paul Martin saying that almshouses don't have rent, only WMC, which probably stands for something that you know about, Angela, but I don't. Is WMC always interchangeable with rent within the legislation?
I don't know what WMC is.
Okay, all right, Paul, if you can come back to us with that would be really helpful. Meanwhile, I've got a quick question for you, Angela. You said that you know that there are layers associated with this, lots of layers, and it does sound quite complex. Realistically, for small organizations that perhaps might want to put their house in order, as far as their rents are concerned, with the information and the signposting that you provided to all the various layers, and with a bit of time, do you think somebody could get their heads around this and be able to put their house in order? Or do you think they'd probably need external help?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the size and complexity of your portfolio, actually, Steve. You know, so if you've got a pretty straightforward, you're letting properties at social rent, so therefore at formula rent levels, I think it's pretty easy to get your head around what you might need to do to check that you are compliant. The one thing that I think is perhaps less easy to do is to do what we call the regression analysis. So to take a sample of some of those social rents and to regress them back to formula rents and make sure that you have complied with the rent settlement over a period, that they were set appropriately, and that the rent increases or decreases over the life of that property have been set appropriately. I think that's where people tend to use us, because we have various tools and techniques to do that very quickly for people. I think if you have a range of different tenures within your portfolio, there are easy ways in which you can, take samples of all of them and check to make sure that you're doing things properly once you know what you're looking for. And hopefully this presentation will help to, pinpoint those things that you need to check for.
Yeah. I mean, the way it's shaping up already is as a toolkit that should enable organisations to get their act together. So yeah, no, that's brilliant. So Paul's got back to us, and it stands for weekly maintenance contribution.
Yeah. So in relation to Paul's question about whether that's interchangeable with rent, it doesn't sound like that is rent. So it actually sounds like your properties are exempt, and I think it's about evidencing the exemption from the rent standard, which is probably the issue for you, Paul, rather than the actual calculation of that contribution.
Right, thanks for that, Angela. Okay, just one more brief question from me, but just bat it back if you're going to be tackling it. You mentioned on one of your slides there about officer-led certification in terms of assurance. What kind of things are we talking about? What does good assurance look like?
So I think in terms of, when I say officer-led certification, I mean, what we tend to see most providers doing is having a list of all the things that they have to comply with over over a governance year, for example. and officers certifying that those things have been done correctly and that they are appropriate. What from time to time we then see is that perhaps if you have an audit committee within your organisation, I know not all small housing associations will, so it could be the board, that they might do a deep dive into that area. So I would always recommend doing a deep dive into rent from time to time, and therefore then looking at what's the evidence that we are compliant with the various areas. So I would just say for each of your tenures, how do you know that you are compliant? And it's almost like you can tick the box that we've done these things appropriately. But I think that's a good way of doing it for a board. So you're not, bombarding them with loads and loads of detail, but you're actually able to say with confidence that you are sure that you comply, and then from time to time do that deep dive.
Yeah, brilliant. And complemented with the internal and external audit, that should represent a rounded assurance. Right?
Yeah, although I have to say, I think external audit in terms of accounts don't go anywhere near it. They just take that your income is your income. Yeah.
Okie dokes.
Okay.
Right, no, that's brilliant. We'll crack on.
All right, so a bit of policy detail, for which, forgive me, I am not going to talk to every single element of these slides, but I am going to pick out some key areas. This is more of a reference tool really for yourselves. So if we start with what is the majority of social housing stock is let at formula rent levels. The policy statement makes clear that those properties cannot be let at anything higher than formula rent. Formula rent is calculated on the basis of a percentage of national average rents with county earnings, a bedroom weighting, and we call that the 1999 formula rent. And when I talked about regression analysis there, you should be able to work your properties back to 1999 and then apply what was the rent increase or rent decrease, because we've had 4 years of a rent decrease, 5 years of rent decrease in place. So you should be able to then work that backwards to be able to see that the rent that you're charging now is compliant. The formula rent is then, it says uprated, but we have had down ratings, as I've said, as set out in a government statement settlement every year. Or we've just had a 4-year rent settlement, and next year will be the final year of that. Flexibility is the ability for you to increase that formula rent above the above the settlement based on your local circumstances and affordability, and it's designed to get rents to a consistent level. So if your rent is below the formula rent, you can increase it by a further 5% for general needs or 10% for supported housing. That must be set out in your rent policy. It must have been agreed by a board, and it must be applied consistently without use of discretion. And you can only use that on a relet of a property. So, but you are able to use that flexibility in order to increase rents to a more consistent level. Affordable rent with a capital A is only permitted under an agreement with Homes England or the Secretary of State or the GLA. That is rent inclusive of all service charges must not exceed 80% of the gross market rent, and it can't be lower than the potential formula rent for that property. There's a RICS valuation methodology, a comparison methodology. You don't have to use a RICS surveyor to do that. You can have an in-house way of doing it. But what you need to do is have that process set out. You need to ensure that you're doing it correctly and consistently, and you've got an audit trail that provides you with evidence of it. What do we see going wrong with affordable rents? We see a lot of providers forgetting that service charges are part of the 80% and charging service charges on top of it. We see providers not calculating a formula rent to check whether the potential rent is that the 80% of market rent is lower than formula rent. That doesn't apply in many areas of the country, but there are parts of the country where the formula rent is actually higher than the 80% of affordable rent. We also see that there is very little, in some providers, not very good controls over how you are setting that 80% of market rent, that they're not reviewed on a regular basis, and that actually we've seen some organisations having too many properties within that portfolio at affordable rent outside of what their formal supply agreement is with Homes England. So Homes England will have said back in, I think it was 2014, that their organisations could convert X amount of properties to affordable rent, and then new build schemes can be let at affordable rent. But we have seen some providers using affordable rent for properties which are not really eligible to be affordable rent. So controls across your portfolio, how you set it, how you ensure that service charges are part of that, and the fact that you have documentary evidence. And the last point is that the annual rent increase for affordable rent cannot be more than CPI plus 1%. And I think there's also that thing about continually checking your market to make sure that you're keeping pace, because 80% of gross market rent when you first let a property could be quite different if you're 10 years on now from doing that. There's guidance on conversion of tenures, how you can move between tenures. So basically social rent remains social. It can't become affordable rent unless it's part of that conversion programme. It can't become market rent, it can't become an intermediate rent. Affordable rents equally can't become market rent or intermediate rent. There are some very, very technical exemptions to this, which I'm not going to go into, but on the whole, these are your sort of broad parameters for working. There's a definition for supported rent, there's a definition for social rents with high incomes, but you needn't bother about that because they wrote it into the policy statement, but then decided we didn't have to apply. There's guidance on how to undertake property valuations. Now, this is important. It's property valuations for the 1999 formula rent purposes, and it's property valuations for the affordable rent market comparison purposes. And you can do generic valuations where you've got a lot of similar stock, but where you've got bespoke properties, and I will talk a little bit in a moment about supported properties. There are, you need to get into much greater detail around how you find comparative valuations within the market to evidence that you are setting rents below market level. There's also guidance on fair rents. We find that as fair rents become smaller and smaller part of the registered provider portfolio, they're getting less and less attention, and a lot of organisations haven't kept up to speed with how you review fair rents and what you can charge. So I've set out there what the policy statement says. We often find that sometimes rents are being charged at a higher level than those set by the rent officer, and that perhaps they've even been increased by a level that they shouldn't have been increased by. The statement doesn't apply to the list of properties that are set out there. They're all fully defined in the policy statement. I'm just going to pick a couple of things out here around, particularly around exempt criteria for specialised supported housing, which is can be for homelessness, it can be for properties which require intensive care and support. So there is a whole set of criteria that you must comply with in order to be exempt. And this is a big issue, again, in the sector where there hasn't been enough attention paid to collating that evidence when a property is either first developed or acquired or commissioned. In particular, there's a great deal of over-reliance on the fact that their property could be commissioned. And so for specialised supported housing, two of the key criteria are that it shouldn't have been developed with any form of public subsidy. And the second is that it needs to have been commissioned from some agency, local authority, care, health authority, for example. But as part of that commissioning, the rent should have been agreed. And what's happening, we're seeing a lot in the sector, is there is an over-reliance on the Housing Benefit Department agreeing that rent. That isn't evidence of compliance with the exemption criteria at all. Housing benefit legislation is completely separate from the rent legislation. And oftentimes we find that there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that specialised supported housing exemptions have been fully documented. The other thing that I would say is there's also an assumption that if it was compliant at the start of a tenure, that it remains compliant. And again, I was talking to Steve earlier that this is not often the case, or you need to regularly review that the property is still compliant with the exemption criteria. Just done some work with a provider where for 2 of their properties, their care and support has been so successful that the 2 individuals who live there no longer require the level of support and care and guidance that they were getting previously. And as a result, their support from the local authority has been withdrawn. The property no longer is exempt, and they've had to set formula rents on those properties, which mean that the scheme doesn't stack up, and they now have to subsidise it. Just because that the scheme, and just because the individuals who live in it were fulfilled the criteria for exemption at the start, does not mean that they continue to do so, and it certainly does not mean that the scheme continues to do so purchasing. I'm just going to stop there, just in case I can see there are some more questions, Steve. So.
Yeah, thanks for that, Angela. Well, we've got young Lee as saying we'd like to let some of our social rent properties to key workers and charge London living rents, which are above formula rents. Do we need to seek permission? I contacted Homes England, who referred me to GLA, and we've not been able to get an answer.
Yes, you do need to get permission, so you need to be persistent, and it would be the GLA, I think in your case, that would have to give you that permission, and you would have to have it documented. And personally, I wouldn't make any changes until you have something in writing.
Brilliant, thank you. Imtiaz is saying, does the formula rent take into account co-ops who are exempt from the rent freeze?
Yes, it does take into account co-ops. You just simply you're starting from a different point, basically. But yes, it does. And the list of those organisations that were exempt from the rent reduction is set out actually in it's the, well, I'm going to talk about it, but it was in the Welfare Reform and Work Act, which set that out. I'm going to talk about that shortly.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And we might be getting into the difference between affordable with a big and a little a here, but what category does the London living rent fall into, social or affordable?
I think it's one on its own, actually, as far as I'm aware.
Right. Just while you're there, Angela, on it, how are you defining affordable with a small a and a big A? And apologies if you've already explained this.
Affordable with a capital A is the 80% of market rent. Affordable with a lowercase a is just a, I mean, it's really
what we all know and love. Sub-market
but
housing.
it's not necessarily social rent, actually, because in some areas social rent is not affordable.
Right.
It's about, as a board and as an organisation, you knowing your local operating context, knowing what incomes are like, and taking that into account. And I actually think it's quite important, that point at the moment, because there are lots of boards having a debate about whether to take the full rent increase for next year. So it's knowing your local context and the impact on affordability in the whole, against rising costs of living, etc., is quite important.
Right, brilliant, thank you. And Phil Green, I'm going to have to read this one out because I haven't had a chance to scan it properly. We operate a number of temporary social housing projects in conjunction with local authority partners, some using properties leased from the local authority and others where we own the properties outright. Is this still the case that only in the case of leases of less than 2 years duration can we charge rents above social rent levels?
I mean, I'm not sure I can look at that without seeing the detail of the lease, but the one thing that I would say is, Phil, if your organisation is the landlord of those properties and you're the one who's issuing the tenancies, then because they're temporary social housing projects, you would be, so long as you have all the criteria, to my mind, they would be exempt from the rent standard. So you would have to fulfill that criteria for temporary accommodation and the criteria that's set out in the exemption criteria to enable you to set rents that are above social rent levels.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That's where we're up to. We've sorted the questions.
Okay.
Crack on if you like.
Crack on. Okay. So other legislation, because there is other legislation. So I talked about the Welfare Reform and Work Act of 2016. So this effectively introduced the 1% rent decrease. There were some exceptions, but it was for 4 years. And for supported housing, I said 5 years earlier, it was 4 years. And for supported housing, it was for 3 years. That this particular act reiterates an awful lot of what was in the policy statement that I've just talked about, and it also reiterates the schedule of formula rents, and it sets out all the criteria again for exemptions and exceptions. There's very detailed information in there about what is deemed to be evidence around the exemption criteria. And just to reinforce that, given that we've had a couple of questions about specialised supported housing and temporary social housing, so there has to be no public funding having gone into the property, so either in its acquisition or development. There has to be documented evidence of health, social care, local government commissioning, and that has to make reference to agreeing the rent for that property. And as I said earlier, housing benefit eligibility doesn't cut it in this respect. That's just what housing benefit are willing to pay. That is not evidence of the rent being agreed at the point of commissioning. There has to be an audit trail for that. And the other thing that the Welfare Reform and Work Act also did was restate the definition of affordable rents. So really the only new thing that produced in many respects was the decrease criteria. The rent standard, the latest edition of the rent standard is April 2020. This then brought in back to a rent increase of CPI plus 1%. CPI is always set on the September level of the previous year. And the rent settlement was for social and affordable rents, and it was for a period of at least 5 years. So as I said, next year is the final year of that settlement at the moment, but who knows where the government might go next. One thing that is quite important, and again has caught out a number of registered providers, is that just because the settlement was from April 2021, it didn't mean that you were excused from fully implementing the rent decrease for 4 years for general needs and 3 years for supported housing. You had to have completed that 4 years of a decrease before you could put the rent up. This did catch a lot of organisations out, particularly those that don't necessarily increase their or review their rents in March, or they have 2 different review dates in a year. Lots of organisations do that. So some providers found that they increased their rents before they'd done 4 years of the rent decrease. And when I was talking about a regression analysis to make sure that you've done what you needed to do with the properties, that's one of the things that we always check. Did the property have 4 years or 3 years if it was supported housing of 4 full years of a decrease? And some organisations were caught out, they only did 3 years and 9 months. Because of the time that they next review the rent. So that's quite an important thing to check. There was also a requirement that all organisations considered their local market and affordability, as we've just been talking about, before they implemented the increase. And again, there should be, a board paper to show that that has been considered at that particular time. There were some limits around where you could move to, and there were also some limits to ensure that the rate of increase at that time was not so significant that it was going to create an issue for affordability for residents. So there was, for the first year of the standard, there was a limit called the 2020 limit to manage that transition from decrease to uplift. And there was also at the time, in terms of the process around decrease and then moving back to an increase, a sort of exemption period for providers if they thought that the implementation of the decrease was going to damage their viability. There's only one organisation in the whole country who talked to the regulator about that. And finally, I'm just going to quickly cover service charges. I am not an expert in service charges. Please don't ask me any questions about it because I'm just not going to be able to answer it. It's something that is incredibly technical. But what I will point you to is service charges must be very clearly articulated in your tenancy agreement or your license or whatever form of tenure you're offering. And they must be compliant with the Landlord and Tenants Act of 1985. So that tells you, this legislation has not been amended in a long time. Service charges have to be linked to your actual costs. So that's regardless of whether you're charging variable or fixed service charges, they have to be based in reality rather than some sort of guesstimate. I say that because we still come across heroic guesstimates of what people should be charging. They have to be reasonable, they have to be transparent, tenants have to be clearly informed in a user-friendly and accessible way about what they're paying for and how that has been calculated. Rents have to be separated from the service charge elements, and there is a statement in the rent standard that registered providers must aim to keep increases in service charges within CPI plus 1%. Now that's going to be interesting next year because there are elements of service charges which are subject to quite high escalating costs, energy, for example. So keeping within that, within that parameter of CPI plus 1 is going to be an interesting task. And that's it. So I'm going to stop and we can take some more general questions now. I think we've got about 15 minutes left.
Brilliant. Thanks, Angela. Well, as Angela says, we've got 15 minutes. We've got no questions at the moment. Such was the comprehensiveness of that presentation. We have got Angela with us. She is an expert, notwithstanding what she's just said in her preamble. This is a chance to put some thorny issues, though not on service charges, to her. So you won't be surprised, Angela, to find out that I've got a question for you. You were talking about boards needing reassurance that their executive teams have a benchmark, for want of a better expression, the affordability of their rents and their plans. What does a good exercise look like? What kind of things, have you got any top tips for how they should go about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, and it's pretty lively at the moment because of the, I suppose, concerns about what the impact of a large rent increase. I mean, although inflation wasn't as high as we thought it was going to be in September, it's still, a significant rent increase compared to last year if you implement the full rent increase in March 2022. So lots of registered providers are clearly thinking about what might be the impact on their tenants and residents so we've got the decrease in universal credit, potential changes to the triple lock around pensions. We've got issues to do with energy and just general cost of living increases. So, in terms of kind of safeguarding the impact on tenants and residents, clearly there's lots of boards that are alive to that. So the sort of things that they've been looking at is demographic information for the areas in which they have accommodation. The difficulty with that is it's always out of date, isn't it? Because you can't find that information. So supplementing that with some anecdotal information or research from local recent sources around what's happening in the local areas in terms of socio-economic jobs, etc., is helpful. I do think, though, that the other side of that is about boards having robustly stress tested any options around maybe not taking the full rent increase and what that means across the life of their 30-year business plan, because any decision that's made now not to take a full rent increase will have an impact over 30 years, which you can't change. You won't ever get that money back. And given the competition around resources at the moment and the strategic choices that boards are having to make around investment in their current stock, investment in new stock, zero carbon, building safety, etc., pay for their staff as well. You know, that's an element within it, you know, making sure that staff are paid appropriately, because that's a concern. You know, if staff are faced with the same changes and increases in their living costs, I think it's a difficult and tough choice to make, not to take the full rent increase because resources are so tight. So that would have to be really, you know, if I was sitting around a board table, I'd want to see quite a bit of evidence about what does this mean for us going forward. And I suppose, and there's a, you know, this is a political point, I think if the sector was to say we don't need to take the full rent increase, but we can still deliver everything we want to deliver, that's an interesting door to open with government. Equally, I would also say, I would think if you were to not take the full rent increase, but do it on the basis that you are changing, streamlining, trimming, for example, what your plan might be around asset management or whatever that might be, I think you're opening yourself up to some quite robust challenge from the regulator in that respect as well. So I think there's a lot to think about around rent at the moment. And I don't think it's an easy time at all to be a board member trying to juggle that responsibility towards your social purpose with your responsibility to running a viable organisation.
I know for a fact that a lot of our members here are going through a significant soul-searching exercise with their boards around this, because obviously there's all the levelling up agenda, and social landlords could be a major agent in facilitating that. But like you say, once it's gone, it's gone. It's out of your business plan forever. Yeah. And I think that the term that you use, political, is absolutely right, because I think to some extent providers are almost stuffed on this issue, whichever way they jump on it, because the malicious and malevolent can make of it what they will and lay it at the door of the sector. And I know I was in a meeting with the regulator a few weeks back, and this is definitely on their risk assessment of how providers navigate the rents that they set, because like you say, there are so many demands being placed upon a finite pot of money coming over the hill in the next few years. But we also know that governments of a certain persuasion like to beat the sector as fat cats and taking the money. So yes, I think it's a real tough one, but I guess your point as well is being able to evidence quite solidly whichever way you jump on this, and be able to communicate that to stakeholders appropriately.
Yeah. I think actually that point, Steve, around you know, whatever decision a board takes, being able to completely explain that to tenants and residents. I mean, there isn't necessarily the time, and there certainly isn't the requirement that you kind of consult in a formal way around it. But if it means that, you know, certain plans have to alter or change, you know, there is that accountability to tenants and residents about what that might mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, brilliant. I've managed to filibuster long enough to get some questions in. So young Lee's come back and said, when we registered fair rents this year, one of the registered rents came back below the property's rent and service charge. We reduced its service charge, so it's at registered rent level. Is this the right way to resolve it?
I'm going to take a pass on this one, but what I would say is if young Lee wants to send me an email, I know a man who can answer that question. I'm quite happy to send her a response, or a response directly.
There you go, young. You've managed to get some free consultancy on that one. Nice one. Okay, and David Heals, any guidance or best practice on defining market rents when calculating the affordable rent? I guess this ties in with my previous question.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
So if it's an affordable rent with a capital A, as in set out by Homes England or whatever agreement you've got, then it's absolutely set out in the rent standard, the RICS methodology that you, so basically it has to be a RICS Red Book methodology whereby you find comparative properties in the local area, look at average market rents and set a rent that's 80% of that. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't, as I say, have to be subject to a RICS survey doing that piece of work for you. There are various tools available that you can buy to do it, or you can simply do a review of the local market if you haven't, using access to Rightmove, she says, Zoopla, all those things, there's lots of tools available. So if it's, the problem comes where it's a property that might not necessarily be, where there might not necessarily be clear comparables. So if you were looking at shared accommodation, supported accommodation, there are different tools and techniques that you can use. Our advice with that is that you always use as a starting point, you do actually get a RICS surveyor to give you a methodology that they can certify and assure for you, which you can then either then replicate in-house, or from time to time you ask them to check and review it. So it really does depend on what kind of property you're looking for and how much of that there is in your local area. There are, so for example, if you are perhaps, if you're working in an area where most of the accommodation is actually social housing and there aren't that many private rentals for you to compare, you can actually move outside of that. What you need to be very careful about, and again, this has caught some organisations out, they have used as their comparators other RPs, not necessarily letting their properties at affordable with a capital A rents, and therefore they're setting them too low, and it's income foregone in terms of, not all of this is about setting rents that are too high. We also see some providers that are setting rents which are far too low because they're using the wrong comparators. So there's a load of technical detail, David, but our advice is always, if it is an unusual property, there isn't anything that is similar, then our first point of call would always be to get a reputable RICS survey to do the comparison for you, and it's really not that expensive, but it can really help you out.
Thanks, Angela. And just as you've been casting around, every now and again, well, there's a number of different models for calculating affordability that various social/economics organizations come up with. Is there any one particular model that's grabbed you?
So you're talking about just general affordability?
Yeah.
No, none at all. And I think it's I wouldn't choose one above the other, to be honest. It is, so there are lots of calculations out there about living costs as a percentage of your income, etc. I think you can end up going down a bit of a rabbit hole with all of them, to be honest, and in some respects, I suppose that if you're looking at formula rents, particularly social rents, and whether to apply flexibility or to take the full amount of rent increase, affordability is not necessarily, I know we say you should be mindful of affordability and know the impact on your local kind of communities, etc. But in reality, it's pretty prescribed, so, and then if you're not going to take it, you're then in the realms of what we were talking about earlier. With the affordable with a capital A, again, it's prescribed. It's 80% of the local market, and that is deemed to be affordable. So there isn't a huge amount of manoeuvre. So I wouldn't spend, a huge amount of time and resource trying to define exactly what affordability is for your local area. I think it's just being mindful about what available data you can find.
Right, okay, that's useful to know. And David's come back with, we're setting up a traveller site which Homes England are insisting we do as affordable with a capital A there. Can't find any comparisons.
And that's where I would say, I would go to a RICS surveyor who knows about the social housing sector, probably dealt with something similar elsewhere, and agree a scope for them to go away and find you some comparables. However, I mean, this just to me sets out how slightly bananas our housing policy is, because affordable rents on a traveller site seems to me a bit odd, but it's not the oddest thing I've heard recently. But that's where I would definitely go to a RIC surveyor and get them to do the job for you. Because it's not that they will find a comparator traveller site. What they will do is make some assumptions around what might be comparable accommodation and be able to find that. So it could be that they look at residential parks, and that might be a similar comparator. But so long as they have signed it off as a red book valuation, you're covered.
Brilliant. No, really great advice. That's it. That's all our questions. I think you answered all my questions. I didn't realise it was going to be so interesting. But there you go.
Glad to be of help.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for your time and effort, Angela, and for essentially coming up with a toolkit for organisations to get going. They know, you know, your details are on the slides. If they need to get in contact with you, they can do it. But I think, I mean, hopefully you've given some the confidence to crack on and make some headway. And if they need the help, they need the help. And yeah, tons of great pointers. We just got a few comments coming in saying thanks so much. Really good session. So you're getting good feedback already. So
excellent.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks so much for attending. We're going to be putting your presentation and a recording of this on the website. It will be available forever, and we do hope that you'll come back and talk to us about another topic, perhaps leaseholders.
That's not me, but anyway.
No, I'm joking. No, it'd be great to see you again anyway.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. And thanks everybody else for attending. If you want to attend any of our other workshops, webinars even, that are coming up over the next couple of weeks, check out our website. Thanks everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.